We're all aware of how famous the katana is among swords. The iconic Japanese sword appears in almost every show, game, anime, manga, or comic featuring a sword-wielding character. It's not surprising that many people started collecting them because of this. Due to the legendary dedication of Japanese swordsmiths to their craft, the katana has almost become mythical. In this video, we'll talk about this process of turning low-quality iron sand into lethal steel. Stay tuned. To begin, we need to know what the hype is all about. The great Japanese swordsmiths were more like alchemists rather than blacksmiths. The traditional sword-making process was certainly not simple, and a deep understanding of chemical metallurgy was required. A lot of craftsmen would spend their entire days working for months, if not years, to create a single blade. Yikes! We're exhausted just thinking about all that effort. The upsurge of family heirloom swords brought back as war trophies to the United States by Japanese officers. These men were mostly descendants from samurai families after World War II, and it has also added to the interest in these weapons. However, the increase in demand has resulted in an increase in mass-produced substandard swords. But how are these swords made? The first step is to make the steel. Tamahagane, which literally means jewel steel, is the ore used to make a genuine katana. The entire process of smelting tamahagane out of satetsu, which is black iron sand, is extremely complex. It entails heating a mixture of satetsu and matsuzuri, which is pine charcoal, to produce a steel bloom. Once the proper temperature is reached, the masters must closely watch the tatara. The tatara is the large clay furnace where all the magic happens. They observe it and keep feeding in the ingredients as needed. This step is critical, and the team has to be available for 72 hours without interruption. The majority of what is created at this point is unlikely to be useful to make a sword, but it can be used to make other tools. Display pieces, on the other hand, are frequently crafted from 440 stainless steel, a brittle material that fails stress testing once drawn out to sword lengths, so technically it's made out of leftovers. Next, they have to sort out the pieces. When the swordsmith gets the tamahagane, they start breaking the ore into pieces in order to sort it into softer and harder steels. They are also sorted based on carbon content. Separate components are heated and hammered into thin, quarter-inch thick wafers. The swordsmith learns to tell what each bit of tamahagane would become based on its color and shear. This is by no means an exact science. Since ancient smiths relied so heavily on the color of the steel, work was often done in the dark. A rounded-off shear distinguishes the softer pieces. Cleaner edges highlight harder pieces. In reality, the tamahagane bits can be divided into 5 whole categories, but that's too much for us. When skillfully blended, high-carbon and low-carbon steel impart a razor sharpness and toughness to the blade. So to make it super sharp, you need both the elements. A sword made of only one type of steel might result in a blade that's too brittle or easily dulled. And here's the secret recipe. The most common sword composition layout includes 2 kinds of steel. The spine of the blade is formed by the inner layer, known as shingane. It lets the metal bend and soak up tension, which is vital when dodging an oncoming sword. The outer layer, or kawagane, is harder and will keep a sharp edge for many centuries if properly maintained. It's a forever sword. Now it's time to assemble the sword. After assembling the block by attaching the ore pieces, it's rolled up in wet rice paper and drizzled with straw. Are you all thinking what we're thinking? Sounds like they're making sushi and not a killer sword. So anyway, the paper and straw serve 2 purposes. They help to reduce carbon loss through oxidation, and they keep the block together so it can be crafted. The steel is heated but not too close to its melting point. You never want to fully melt steel that's intended to forge into a sword, as it affects the metal's molecular structure. That's right, all of those movie scenes in which a smith pours a bucket of melted metal into a mold and waits for it to cool are just wrong. We're having major Game of Thrones flashbacks. You know which scene we're talking about. Let's not go there. When the metal has reached a sufficient temperature, the smith takes it away from the forge and starts hammering it flat. They cut it into the bar when it is thinned enough. The next step is to start refining. This phase involves folding the metal over on itself using a technique known as mizuuchi, which means water striking. The primary goal of folding and hammering steel is to take all contaminants and voids out of the metal. The impurities are drawn to the surface by the force of the hammer blow and the thermal shock of the cold water. And this is where the grunt work begins. A real katana is folded up to 20 times. Each time, the billet is cut along a different axis. If you know your powers of 2, you'll realize that folding something in half that many times yields an absurdly large number of layers. Any advantage from steel folding diminishes after this point. At this point, let's talk about a popular myth. Many katana enthusiasts believe that steel folding improves the sword's qualities to near mythical levels. While folding the steel has religious significance, it simply transforms what was originally low-quality iron into a thing that can compete with other swords. The tamahagane is hammered into a trough-like shape after the block is folded, and the smith is pleased with its pure enough composition. It's then put aside. The shingane is now created using the low-carbon steel that's to be the sword's core. It's time to put the two halves of the steel block that will become the final katana together. The shingane is hammered into the tamahagane. The block can now be extended to sword length. The smith starts working on the basic geometry of the blade. Then it's time for the shaping. After a round of coating the blade with charcoal powder to protect it, it's time for making its shape. The blade is removed from the fire and immersed or quenched in water. The sword then bends due to the difference in the extent and speed of contraction between the two types of steel in the blade. This is how the sword gets its curvy look. And here's some sword science for you. So in Japanese swords, 3 types of sori, or curves, can be seen. The first is koshizori, or waist curve, which can be seen on ancient Jokoto and Koto swords, with the deepest portion of the curve closer to the blade's tang end. The second, which can be seen on newer Shinto, is known as the nakazori, middle curve, or torizori. The sword seems to curve evenly throughout here. And finally, the sakizori, or tip curve, is on newer Shinto blades. It can also be found on many present reproduction blades. Finally, they polish it up. And yes, finally we're at the end of this laborious process. At this point, the smith's work is complete. The sword is then given to a polisher, who is in charge of defining the shape and edge of the blade. The polisher begins the shitaji toji, which is a rough polishing process, with a coarse stone known as an uchigumori. We love how they have a unique name for each step. So he rubs the sword on it, shaping the blade and removing any forging scratches or marks. Next, he washes it before beginning the finer polish with a finer grade of stone. In this stage of polishing, the stones are connected to paper and rubbed at specific angles to emphasize the sword's bevel while also removing any traces from the previous polishing step. Although it's not like you're going to be making yours tomorrow, but keep in mind that the tang end is never polished or cleaned. You do that and you automatically reduce the hilt's ability to hold the blade in position with friction. The finished blade is then returned to the smith, who inspects it and corrects any flaws. The sword can then be given its dressing, or furniture as they say, which is made and decorated by a variety of artisans. The handle may be made of leather, gold, or stones. These final steps require almost as much skill as making the blade itself does. After passing the final inspection, the sword is ready to be presented to its master. But now this skillful process is more useful in the kitchen than at battlefront. The modular construction of the katana differentiates it from other swords. The blade is the sword's true heart. The other parts, such as the handguard or scabbard, can be replaced when needed. A single genuine katana can take nearly 3 months to make. Even with weaker steel, ancient Japanese swordsmiths were able to use this crafting process to create a weapon worthy of its reputation. As the demand for swords declined, craftsmen and manufacturers shifted their focus to the production of knives. Many of the same methods and designs are still used in the art of Japanese cutlery, which stems directly from Japanese sword making, with genuine traditional samurai swords picking up exorbitant prices. Should they ever be found for sale, having a quality piece of Japanese cutlery is the next best thing. We don't know about you, but we'd much rather have the sword. That's a wrap for this video. See you in the next one.